Hi guys, this is Caleb with DSLR Video Shooter, and today we are finally doing the review of the Blackmagic Cinema Camera Pocket. Hey guys, this is Caleb with DSLR Video Shooter, and we are finally doing the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera review. I've had this guy for around 30 days, and I have come to love and hate this little camera. There's a lot to talk about, so I'm going to do my best to get it in a concise, short review, but still have enough information for you guys to make a decision on whether or not this would be the camera for you. So we're going to talk about a lot. We're going to be covering the image as well as the actual camera itself. And the biggest thing I want to point out right out of the gate is that while this is called the Pocket Cinema Camera, it really isn't built to be used like a pocket cinema camera. What you think of in your head when you hear that name is just you and the camera and a lens running around getting shots, but it really isn't usable in that state. And it's a little deceptive, but at the end of the day, it is tiny, so the name kind of makes sense. But this is more how I would use this camera. It really needs to be stabilized, and it's kind of difficult to use on its own, so there's a lot of things you can do, like add a rig. A monitor is going to be really important for reasons we're going to get into later, and then things like this back here, this battery pack, which has been sent to me from Switchtronics, and we're going to talk about that, and I'll do a separate review for that. All of these things make this camera a lot easier to use because it has a lot of shortcomings. And when you add the camera to something like this with a monitor, I did some filming and it's just a dream. It feels like you have an Arri Alexa on your shoulder, and the image out of it's incredible. But something like this is just amazing. So adding it to a rig and really building the camera up does wonders, and you can get that amazing film look with the high dynamic range on a shoulder rig with such a small, great camera. So let's go ahead and talk about the body and build quality of the camera itself. It has a really nice feel. I really like the material they use for the grip. It's different material for the back. It's like a black aluminum. The buttons are very shallow, and there's not many of them on the entire camera. And then if you look on the side of the camera, you have the 12-volt power, HDMI, your mic input, your headphone jack, and a jack for control. When you flip the camera over to look at the bottom, you have a little flap where you can access the battery compartment as well as the SD card slot, and then you have your USB cord for updating the camera. One thing I found really annoying was that the battery door doesn't close when you push it down. You have to get back in there and slide it over. I think that's a fairly poor design by Blackmagic, but that's what we have to work with. On the top of the camera, you have a 1/4-20 that is mounted very securely to the top of the camera, as well as one on the bottom of the camera. The lens mount is really nice on this camera. I found that the lenses I had been using with it worked really well, and I really like the giant aluminum button for pulling the lenses off of the mount and back on. It is an active micro Four Thirds mount, so you do have the ability to use autofocus, even though it's fairly poor on this camera. Next, I want to talk about the menus. This is one of the things that really bothered me about this camera. The menus and the entire screen is not touchable. And essentially what Blackmagic did, to my understanding, is they just took the UI from their other camera, the Blackmagic Cinema camera, and stuck it directly into this little guy and then removed the touchscreen to save space. But the entire user interface is really designed for touch, so it's really difficult to go into the camera and start changing settings. In the camera, you can go in and, for instance, name your project, but this would take forever to type out every single little character because you have to use, the buttons on the side, the arrow buttons, to go from letter to letter. So things like that are super annoying. Just doing something like changing the ISO requires several clicks, and I really think it would be nice if this had a touchscreen. I understand this is a cheap camera, and they're trying to keep space down, or the size down. So adding the touchscreen would cause the price to go up as well as the size of the camera. Now let's talk a little bit about the camera and its functionality as well as how it and what it records. This is really unique, this particular camera, because eventually it's going to have RAW capabilities. Right now it does not. You are only able to record at ProRes. Another thing to note is the dynamic range setting in this camera. You have two options. You have video mode, which is going to give you a very standard kind of a look. You're not going to need to do a lot of post-processing. and then you're going to have a film dynamic range mode. And this is going to create a very flat image, but give you a lot of flexibility in post to grade and color correct your image. Something else that should be noted is that when you set that, you need to go into the display settings and tell the camera how you want it to display the image on your camera. So for instance, it's really difficult to see a lot of detail when you're in film mode. So what you can do is you can tell the camera to record in film mode, but then in the display settings, tell it to display it on the camera screen as video mode. This way you can see what the image is going to look like in post. It's going to give you a better judgment of your exposure and things like that. So you have a little bit of flexibility there, which I thought was really nice. Now let's talk about some of the other functions on this camera. You are a little limited, but there's also some really cool things that they added. The first of which is the focus assist. If you're looking at the camera and the back of the screen, you can find the focus button on the top right. When you press this, whatever is in focus is a very visual green color, which is really cool. And this is a super nice feature for getting focus, something that I think is silly that Canon doesn't have in their DSLRs, but again, that would cannibalize a lot of their other video cameras. Another nice function is double pressing the OK button, and that's going to do a 1:1 scaled crop on your screen and show you a much closer detailed shot of your image, and then you can jump back out. And you can use the focus assist while you're cropped, which is really cool. So this is just two ways to check your focus, which is really nice. Something else this camera has that almost no DSLR has is zebras, and that is so nice after working with DSLRs for so long, is to finally have zebras. You have several options for choosing what level of zebra you would like to display, and it's just such a lifesaver to have this, especially since it's very difficult to look at the screen, which is the next thing we're going to talk about. When you point this thing and you're in the shade, you're okay, it's not too bad, but the second you start to get in direct sunlight, it is virtually impossible to see the screen on this camera. So that's where having an external monitor is going to be very important. So now let's talk about changing some of the other settings on the camera. To change the ISO, you just go into the camera settings and it's displayed as ASA, although it does say ISO at the same time, which is a little strange. When it comes to your shutter speed, it's actually read out in shutter angles. So if you don't know what that means, you should definitely check out, just Google the 180-degree shutter rule and you'll find an article on Wikipedia talking about what that means and how it's used. And then we come to white balance, which is kind of an ugly thing on this camera because you only have Kelvin. And now, to be honest, this really doesn't bother me at all because I almost always shoot on Kelvin with my DSLRs. I think it's a great way to do white balance because you can perfectly dial it in. The problem, however, is that this camera does not have very small increments that you can adjust. So you have massive leaps in your white balance. So you're not going to have very incremental, like by 100 Kelvin, you're going to have several thousand jumps at a time. The good news is you're going to be able to adjust this in post very easily because you have such great dynamic range and color information, but it's just really annoying that you can't perfectly dial it in and play with it to get it just right. So one of the big beefs when it comes to these features is while they're really nice, it's very difficult to change them. Aside from focus and your scaling, it's very difficult to go in, change your ISO, change your white balance. So it's not a very speed shooter friendly kind of a camera because you're gonna have to spend a lot of time jumping through menus and it just feels very different. So that's gonna take some time to get used to. And one thing that I think Blackmagic could definitely add to their cameras is allowing users to assign various menu options to the camera button. While this camera has a micro four thirds active mount, it does not have a micro four thirds sensor. The sensor on this is actually a Super 16 sensor. So it has a very hardcore crop on the camera, but you can still use some great lenses with it. And you can actually get an adapter and use Nikon or Canon lenses. So these lenses, I have two primes with me that I've been using and have been really liking. Both of these lenses are amazing. The quality on these are incredible. They're all manual and fully metal, and the focus pulls are just brilliant. Really like these lenses. And because this is a smaller sensor, you're not going to be plagued with rolling shutter as much as you would on an APS-C or full frame sensor. I also noticed that the moire and aliasing on this are not nearly as bad as DSLRs. So as you can see in this example, you're getting barely any. If you look really close, you can still find it, but it's got nothing compared to something like a 70, which is shown here. Another thing that's kind of tough with this camera is how quickly it consumes battery. The battery that comes with the camera from Blackmagic drains super quickly. I would recommend buying several of these Watson batteries that you can find. They're around $15 and they're a little better than the one that comes with the camera. They last a little longer, have a little more power, which is great. But more so than that, I would really encourage you to get something like a Switchtronics power pack that you can purchase for around $100, and that's going to give you a lot more battery life. Something else that really needs to be noted is that this thing is really picky about the cards you use. I have several SD cards. Most of them are cheaper Transcend cards that work fine for DSLRs and are really cheap and affordable. Those wouldn't even show up. Even the faster ones that I have just literally would not register at all on the camera. It was like there's nothing in the slot. So you really have to go for the SanDisk Extreme Pro cards, and those cards I've had complete success with and they've worked really well. So you're going to spend a little more on cards, but it makes sense because you're capturing an image that has a lot more data, so those fast cards are going to be important. And that brings me on to file size. This thing records much larger files, so a 16 gig card might last you quite a while on a DSLR, but that's going to disappear before you believe it on this camera. So you're going to want larger cards or more of them, and keep that in mind when you go out and film. While we're talking about cards, we should talk about formatting. This camera, you cannot format the cards in the camera, and like an idiot when I got this camera and took it on a trip, I forgot to format it on my computer because I'm so used to formatting it in camera. So I took this thing out and wasn't able to use it at all because I did not format the card. So make sure you format it in your computer before you go anywhere, and format often so you can get rid of old files. Because another fun little thing about this camera is you cannot delete files from the camera. So if you did a 5-minute shot and it turned out to be garbage, you're sunk. You just can't delete it. You're just gonna have to live with it or format your card to get that space freed up. When we look at frame rates on this camera, we have 23.97, 24, 29.98 I think it is, and 30. So that's it. Oh, you also have 25 for our UK bros out there. And you do not have 60 frames per second or anything else. So you're gonna get just that small window of frame rates, which to me doesn't really bother me. And all of this stuff, you gotta keep in mind that price. It's under $1,000, which is ridiculous to begin with. So having those shortcomings makes complete sense. Something else that is really annoying with this camera is when you're looking at the screen, you hit record, you have no way of telling how much card space you have left. So you're kind of shooting in the dark, make sure you have lots of card space, and that's where this camera really doesn't work well in very time-sensitive, high-pace, fast-paced shooting environments, because you're not going to know how much time you have left. And it's really not cool to be filming something and then suddenly run out of card space. A very simple thing that's really nice is the headphone jack on the camera, but this camera really doesn't deal with audio very well at all. The camera mic is virtually trash, and you have absolutely 0, 9, zip, no way to monitor your levels on this. So we're back to doing dual system sound, but that kind of makes sense if you're going to be using a camera like this, and it doesn't bother me because the way I see this camera, it's more a B-roll film style camera, so you're not really going to be worrying about audio as much. I do really like on the camera screen that there's just that small strip for data at the bottom. It doesn't take up a lot of space and it works really well. You do have the option of turning on and off various settings when you hook this up to a monitor or a digital recorder, which is very cool. All that other stuff aside, this camera has something that just blows everything else out of the water, and that is the image. The image on this thing is absolutely gorgeous. Being able to adjust everything in post is fantastic, and it just looks so crisp and so detailed. So when you look at a shot from this camera right next to something like a Canon 70D, you're going to notice a difference, not necessarily in sharpness, but in the detail of the actual shot. If you're going to use the film dynamic range mode, I would highly suggest reading up on LUTs and understanding high dynamic range and how to edit the image, because you can't just grab a 3-way color corrector and play with the image a little bit. It's going to require a little more than that. And so there's some great resources out there. And obviously DaVinci Resolve is huge, and it's Blackmagic, so that's a great program to use as well. So I think the best way to really summarize this camera is just to look at the pros and cons. Let's start with the pros because there's some really strong points of this camera. The first being the price. Under $1,000 is ridiculous for a camera with this kind of capability. The features are great on this camera. I love having the focus assist and zebras. It's just amazing. And then the actual image itself is incredible. Eventually to have RAW on this would be amazing. Being able to even do ProRes as well as the dynamic range. Unfortunately, that's almost where all the goodness ends, and when you switch over to the con list, it's quite long. The battery life is rough, really rough, especially for something that's advertised to be a small camera that you can run around with. You're not gonna be able to do that without a giant bag of batteries. That's just a fact. Not being able to format your cards in the camera, not being able to delete files off of the card in the camera, not being able to see how much time is left in the camera, not being able to do a lot of white balance adjustments without taking giant increments in your Kelvin. The screen is a little difficult to look at. It's actually kind of a matte finish and you can almost see the texture on the screen. So this is nothing even close to a lot of other screens out there, and not having touch is really difficult. The user interface is kind of a pain to deal with. So those are a lot of things that are on the con side of this camera. It's definitely not an everybody camera. Anyone can take a Canon DSLR and make something amazing with it. You can do a lot with this camera, but it's not really for every shooter out there. So if you like to shoot footage, quickly get it in, tweak it just a little bit and get your content out quickly, this is not gonna be a camera for you. I would not use a camera like this for my show. That would be just pretty stupid because there's more data. I'm gonna be compressing it anyways. I don't wanna have to deal with color correction or anything like that. So using a Canon DSLR is perfect because I can just bang it all out, all my audio's in the camera, throw it on here, not have to mess with color correction much, and I ship it out, we're done. This is also not a camera for someone who just wants to walk around with a messenger bag and poke around the city taking shots. Yes, you could use it for that, but it's going to be very difficult because you have a lot of limitations as well as the battery thing and not being able to use this very easily just as a handheld camera with a lens. You really need to add stuff to it to support it. Where this camera really shines is for people who are looking for just a sensor and really need that high dynamic range. This is going to be a brilliant camera because you can build it up, stick it in all your pre-existing gear and add various lenses to it. Lots of lens flexibility, which is great. And you're gonna get an amazing image. I can also see this being a fantastic camera as kind of a B camera for film production because there could be a group of people with your giant, film rig, depending on what you use. And I can see where this could really work well alongside some of Red's cameras or an Alexa or something like that, where you need to get in a very tight situation and get your footage. This could also be a fantastic camera for drone shooters, people that are using, smaller helicopters and whatnot to film. This could be great. Because in another note, it's really cool. I love this camera, and even though it has a lot of problems and it's not for everybody, I applaud Blackmagic for coming out with something like this and for kind of sticking it to the man when it comes to everybody else. So all in all, this is an amazing piece of technology, a great camera. It's not for everybody, but for those that it is, it's gonna make their day because the image is just incredible.